it and change it and play with it and find something new. There wasn't this, I'm going to repeat myself, a black box. Suddenly I was free to explore and engage with the environment. I missed that. Now, I don't mean to go back to internet bloggers, but another internet blogger recently wrote an article called, "Why are you learning programming for fun? Don't you realise programming is serious business? How dare the mayor of New York go out and learn programming? There's so many things to learn and so many things to do." It's like, maybe it was fun for them. Maybe they're enjoying themselves, and maybe that's actually how you got into it in the first place, you hypocritical bastard. But frankly, that's Jeff Atwood. I have many other opinions about Jeff Atwood. None of them are flattering.
How many of them are fit for public consumption?
In summary, he is a terrible person. Okay, I'll tell you a little story about Jeff Atwood. Jeff Atwood wrote on his blog and saying, "I'm writing a website and the business use case is filtering HTML, and I must understand this in order to run a successful website. There are libraries written by people who understand HTML and parsing and all of the other bits involved. But if I used a library for my code, I wouldn't be doing my core business practice of rewriting strings." So he published his algorithm and people broke it, and he published it again and people broke it, and then after a month of everybody telling him to do it the way that all of the libraries already do, he kind of grudgingly took their advice. And now what he says is, "Now I've gone through this learning experience, none of you have to do it. You can all use my library. You don't have to go and do this in the first place." With no hint of irony. He is a terrible programmer. But really, if you're going to tell people off for learning and playing and exploring, you're a bad person and I hate you. Now, I kind of touched on misogyny before, but this is just kind of a jokey title. Now, some people say you have to learn C. C is a real language. It's used everywhere.
Real man use bullet.
Real men eat quiche. Now, the thing is about C, it's actually quite hard. It's actually quite old. There's a lot of things that you need to do to get it to get up and running. I've seen so many embedded programmers going, "Oh my god, why do I have to include files? What the fuck is this all about?" Really, when you're trying to learn to program, you want to get something up and running, not in an afternoon, not in an hour. You want something up and running now. C is not the language to do this. Now, once you've become comfortable with the shell, become comfortable with an editor, become comfortable with the idea that you run, it crashes, you go and try and fix the problem, you cry a bit. Once you've come to terms with how terrible programming is, C is a perfectly acceptable second language. But frankly, forcing it down beginners' throats is just going to scare people off from the outset. Although, admittedly, I'm pretty sure that's what this talk is doing from the beginning. C is character building. Now, other people will tell you that you need to use what's used in industry. Now, I'm not saying that you need to go out and use these Scratch or various other things and they're bad. They're actually quite fun. But some people will say, "Oh, you must learn Java because you want a job in programming." You don't want a job in programming. Now, the thing is about object orientation is we only developed it in about, well, actually we developed it in 1964, but we've only come to terms with how useful it is in certain places after we've actually written large enough programs to benefit from them. Now, I mentioned before about chanting public static void main. This is what happens when you try and teach object orientation first. You spend the first hour explaining everything that they have to ignore in order to get the thing working. Now, I don't know about you, but teaching people the first lesson of ignore this, don't ask questions about this is too hard, doesn't sound like a really good way to encourage people to be exploratory and creative. Again, it's a better second language, not a first, but maybe third, fourth, fifth, somewhere down the line. Now, a lot of people, when they're learning, they look for ways to avoid learning. Some of you who hang around on forums on the internet where people are asking questions will go, "I want to know if this will work, this 3-line program, and I'm too afraid to run it and see what happens, so I'm looking for some reassurance." This is a direct effect of this overcomplication of learning. Really, people learn with a view of trying to avoid as much work as possible, trying to cut their losses, because some things that you want to learn are just really, really, really hard, and it will take many, many years of your life. So, I don't think we should be teaching complicated languages. I don't think we should be teaching languages that demand that you ignore things, because all it will do is encourage people to ignore things in future and write comments on random people's blogs going, please can you send me the code. Now, another thing about learning programming is some people are like, programming is mathematics, so you must understand group theory, algebraic geometry, and differential geometry. Now, don't get me wrong, maths is important to programming. Maths is very important to programming because there's things like floating point, also known as the incredibly misleading numbers that never really work the way that you want them to. The thing is, not many programs actually demand that much mathematics beyond counting. If you can use a spreadsheet, you already know pretty much every single piece of mathematics you will ever need to know in programming in the real world. Programming is part mathematical, but it's not going to be like cryptology or differential geometry. But there's the same sort of reasoning behind it. There's the same sort of working things through. What I'm really trying to say here is not that programmers should be mathematicians, but programmers are mathematicians. And if you disagree with me, there's a big, big paper called the Curry-Howard isomorphism that says that proofs are programs, but you can look that up when you go home. But ultimately, programming is not just one thing, it's an interdisciplinary thing. You need to be able to write in your native language. You need to be able to have critical reasoning. You need to have engineering discipline, and you need to have that whole sort of mathematical reasoning as well. But the most overlooked skill in programming is understanding the domain of the problem that you're actually solving in the first place. Now, as I slowly get to the end of my talk, I thought I'd share some tips on how to be a successful programmer. But as I said in the beginning, I'm a terrible programmer. I burn out in jobs, I go mad, I drink too much, etc. But other people seem to get along really well in programming, and I've sat and watched them, so I thought I'd share some of the ways in which they do this. Don't write documentation. Documentation means you're replaceable. If you fix a bug, make sure it fixes only that case that they've talked about so that somebody else can reopen the bug later. The standard library is evil. Don't use things other people understand. The best code is the one that you've written yourself. Go crazy with advanced features. Object orientation is not crazy enough. The type signature of your function should be at least 50 pages long. I had a boss who was a PhD. I shouldn't be mentioning about this because it's being recorded, but the thing is, whenever he wrote a program, it wasn't to solve the problem, it was to demonstrate how smarter he was than everyone else in the room. Every single feature was in a different file, and it was fine for him. He could keep all of this complexity in his head. I'm really terrible, I'm really stupid, I can't keep any of this complexity in my head whatsoever, and I constantly struggled to do any of the things they were doing. Eventually I caught up and I realised that the entire program was stupid from the outset, but that's another story entirely. But really, you want to use an abstraction, modules, especially if you have to use all the modules together in some weird, awkward incantation to actually get them to work. That works wonders. At a previous company, we had a term called Andre bugs. Now, I'm not going to name the company. I might if you goad me. What we did was we did flight prices, and we had to get child prices for flights. And so what he did is he hard-coded the percentage of an adult flight that would be for the child price. And so somebody would open a bug saying, this flight is wrong. So he'd change the percentage, close the bug. And then 2 days later, someone else would open a new bug saying, this different airline, from a different person, this is also wrong. So he'd change the percentage and close it. And what management saw was all of these bugs being filed and closed within 5 minutes. He is the most productive programmer they have ever seen. Don't forget the useful things like non-deterministic tests that never pass unless you kind of stand on one leg and sort of sacrifice a chicken. Remember, if it takes at least a week to get all the stuff installed on your machine, that's perfect because no one ever can keep up to what you're doing. But ultimately, being a successful programmer is being a solipsist, pretending there are no other people in your team and you're the only hero that can save the world. But ultimately, if you sabotage your company, you will be rewarded. The only time I was actually praised at this job was when I stopped working for 2 weeks and I decided to play something called the CC game. Every time you get an email, you reply to it and add someone else in the company. If you can, copy and paste emails from someone else into the new email, but make sure it's in a Word document. Using the company's formatting, they love that. If you're wondering when you win, it's when the CTO is finally on the end of the email chain and he calls a meeting. And the person who actually raised the bug gives up, throws his hands up in disgust and refuses to talk to anybody anymore. But ultimately, you need to create work for yourself that only you can do, and that's how you will be successful. On the other hand, if you want to be a good programmer, the best way to be a good programmer is try to get fired as soon as possible. You need to stop trying to write code and you need to try to read code. Now, can you imagine if you were trying to talk to an author who writes books and you went to their house and it was barren and the only books on the shelf were the ones that they had written, and because that was all the experience that they needed. I have been to a sci-fi author's sci-fi author's flat, and it was scary. It is the most books I have ever seen in my life. I feared for my life because they would just fall over if you breathed in the wrong place. But frankly, we sit and pride ourselves on all the things that we've created rather than all of the things that we've learnt from. There's another sort of adage to that, in that often I've been going through CVs and people write, I have 10 years experience of C++, and you don't see what they've read, what they've done, or what the other, and pretty much all that means is I've done 1 year 10 times. Now, sorry, my notes are wrong. I'm going to have to improvise now. Now, sometimes people complain that it's really hard to estimate about work and work out what actually needs to be done. But I'm not sure if that's because we're constantly reinventing new stuff, or we kind of refuse to read about all of the people who've done it before. I'm still on the fence about that one. But really, what you really want to do is write code as if you're going to get it wrong, as if all of the assumptions you hold dear will be absolutely stupid. Write code as if you can delete it tomorrow and replace it, because almost certainly you will have to. This is a lot easier if you don't spend all your time writing lots of code. Empathy is fantastic in programming. We need a hell of a lot more empathy. There's this horrible trend where if you ask a programmer a hard question, they'll go, wow, we'll put a checkbox in the program and leave it to the user.